The Kamenets-Podolsky pocket emerged in the spring of 1944 as one of the decisive operations on the Eastern Front, a culmination of developments stretching back to the German defeat at Stalingrad and the Soviet victories at Kursk and along the Dnieper. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht's position in Ukraine had become precarious. After the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the Red Army began a sustained advance westward. Soviet forces liberated Kharkov in August 1943 and forced German withdrawals across the Dnieper by September. The lower Dnieper offensive created a series of bridgeheads for the Red Army, including those at Kiev, Kremenchuk, and Dnipropetrovsk. By November 1943, Kiev had fallen, and the Soviets pressed into right-bank Ukraine. Germany's the 1st Panzer Army, commanded by General Hans Valentin Hüby, numbered roughly 200,000 men. It included the XE and the 3rd Army Corps, the 1st Panzer Corps, and remnants of other units. Equipment was worn, fuel shortages chronic, and many divisions were under strength. For example, some infantry divisions counted fewer than 6,000 men against an authorized strength of 15,000. Panzer divisions often operated with fewer than 50 serviceable tanks. The Soviet Union, under the overall strategic direction of the Stavka and Joseph Stalin, had clear objectives: to expel German forces from Ukraine, liberate the fertile agricultural regions, and push the front line toward Poland and the Balkans. The 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and the 2nd Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Ivan Konev, spearheaded operations. Together, they commanded over 1.2 million troops, supported by about 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 1,500 air. Soviet intelligence identified the 1st Panzer Army as dangerously exposed, operating on extended lines without secure flanks. Its western supply routes relied on limited rail and road corridors through towns such as Kamenets-Podolsky, Proskurov, and Tarnopol. The political context added further urgency. Stalin aimed to liberate all Soviet territory seized in 1941, strengthen Soviet claims in post-war Eastern Europe, and demonstrate the Red Army's ability to conduct deep operations. The Western Allies, preparing for the invasion of France later in 1944, watched closely. Successful Soviet offensives would pin down German forces in the east, preventing their redeployment to the west. Conversely, Adolf Hitler insisted on holding territory in Ukraine for its symbolic and material value. He forbade withdrawals even when tactically necessary, insisting that every town be defended as a fortress. The terrain of western Ukraine played a crucial role. The region was characterized by rolling hills, forests, and river valleys such as the Dniester and the Prut. Roads were few, often unpaved, and spring rains turned them into quagmires. Villages and towns, many with pre-war populations of 10,000 to 30,000, became focal points for both defense and supply. Civilians endured occupation, requisitioning, and displacement. Soviet partisan activity further complicated German supply routes, attacking convoys and rail lines. By early 1944, German intelligence estimated that partisan forces numbered over 100,000 across Ukraine, though their effectiveness varied. The stage was thus set for the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive, launched in March 1944 by Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian Front. Its objective was to cut off Hüb's 1st Panzer Army, severing its retreat westward and annihilating it near Kamenets-Podolsky. For the Germans, it posed the danger of encirclement reminiscent of Stalingrad. The outcome would hinge on operational mobility, the ability of the Red Army to close the encirclement, and the capacity of Hüb's army to break out before destruction. On 4th March 1944, the Soviet 1st Ukrainian Front initiated the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive, striking westward from the Dnieper bridgeheads toward Vinnytsia, Proskurov, and Kamenets-Podolsky. The operation opened with massive artillery barrages and concentrated tank assaults aimed at penetrating the German defenses of Army Group South. Zhukov's front deployed the 1st Guards Army, the 18th Army, and the 38th Army, supported by the 1st Guards Tank Army under General Kadukov. Within the first days, Soviet spearheads advanced up to 20 to 30 kilometers, forcing German infantry divisions to fall back in disorder. Hube's 1st Panzer Army, with its panzer divisions already depleted, attempted to stabilize the front through mobile counterattacks. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandart, and the 16th Panzer Division were brought in to launch spoiling attacks. These actions slowed the Soviet advance, but failed to halt it. By 10th of March, Soviet forces had reached the approaches to Proskurov, a vital rail hub connecting the German armies in western Ukraine. On 22nd of March, Proskurov was captured by the 60th Army. The fall of the city disrupted German logistics, cutting one of the last major supply arteries for the 1st Panzer Army. Soviet air superiority compounded German difficulties. The 2nd Air Army flew over 6,000 sorties in the first 2 weeks, targeting bridges, convoys, and retreating columns. Luftwaffe formations, weakened after years of attrition, could only mount limited responses. As Soviet units pushed further into western Ukraine, they aimed to trap Hube's army in a broad encirclement. To the north, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 60th Army swung south toward Kamenets-Podolsky. To the south, Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front advanced from Uman toward Chernovtsi and the Dniester crossings, sealing the southern flank. By late March, the jaws of the Soviet encirclement began to close. On 25 March, the town of Tarnopol was declared a fortress by Hitler and ordered to be held at all costs. This decision diverted German reserves to defend a position that quickly became isolated, weakening the defense of the main force further west. By the final week of March, the 1st Panzer Army found itself squeezed into a pocket around Kamenets-Podolsky, Proskurov to the east, and the Dniester River to the west. Soviet forces had advanced more than 200 kilometers since the start of the operation, liberating hundreds of settlements and driving a wedge between German formations. Estimates suggest that up to 220,000 German soldiers, with about 200 tanks and assault guns, were at risk of encirclement. Supplies dwindled as ammunition and fuel stocks dropped to critical levels. Many units were forced to abandon heavy equipment, destroying artillery pieces and vehicles they could not move. Roads became clogged with retreating columns of infantry, horse-drawn wagons, and the remnants of panzer units. At the same time, weather and terrain slowed both sides. The thaw of early spring, known as the Rasputitsa, turned roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles bogged down, and logistics became increasingly difficult. The Soviets, with greater manpower and shorter supply routes, could replace losses and push forward. For the Germans, every day of delay risked total destruction. Communication between corps was fragmented, and many veterans of years of Eastern Front combat, the troops understood the necessity of fighting their way westward. Hube began preparing for a breakout, even as Soviet encirclement tightened. The opening phase of the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket thus culminated in a grave crisis for the Wehrmacht. Within 3 weeks, Soviet offensives had surrounded one of Germany's most experienced field armies. The next stage would determine whether Hube's forces could escape through maneuver and discipline, or whether they would face annihilation in a pocket reminiscent of Stalingrad. The strategic goals of both sides in the Kamenets-Podolsky operation became clear by mid-March 1944. For the Soviet High Command, the encirclement and destruction of the 1st Panzer Army was not only a tactical objective, but a decisive strategic opportunity. Eliminating more than 200,000 German troops would weaken Army Group South irreparably, open the road to the Carpathians and eastern Poland, and demonstrate the Red Army's capacity for large-scale deep operations. The Stavka assigned Georgy Zhukov to coordinate the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive and directed that Soviet formations maintain relentless pressure, closing the ring around the German forces. Operational orders stressed cutting all escape routes across the Dniester River and denying the enemy access to bridges and fords. Soviet tank armies were to move quickly into the German rear, severing the few rail and road corridors that remained open. The Soviet fronts concentrated enormous resources for this goal. Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian Front committed the 1st Guards Tank Army, 3rd Guards Tank Army, 4th Tank Army, and multiple combined arms armies. South of the German pocket, Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front advanced to secure the Dniester crossing. Together, the two fronts deployed more than 450,000 men and over 700 tanks in the decisive sectors. Supply lines were reinforced with newly repaired railways extending eastward, while field depots stocked fuel and ammunition closer to the front. Soviet planners assumed that the Rasputitsa would slow German retreat more than their own advance, giving them time to complete the encirclement. Air operations were integrated into the plan, with the 2nd and 5th Air Armies tasked to isolate the battlefield, bomb German columns, and protect Soviet armor. For the Germans, strategic goals diverged between Hitler's orders and Hube's assessments. Hitler insisted that the 1st Panzer Army hold its ground, preventing the Soviets from crossing into Galicia and threatening Hungary. He declared Tarnopol and Kamenets-Podolsky fortresses to be defended at all costs. Withdrawal was explicitly forbidden. This directive reflected Hitler's broader policy since 1943 of forbidding retreats, hoping to stabilize fronts through stubborn defense. However, Hube, supported by Manstein, recognized that remaining in place meant destruction. The 1st Panzer Army lacked reserves, fuel, and ammunition to hold indefinitely. Hube's plan therefore shifted toward a fighting breakout to the west, across the Dniester, where contact could be re-established with Army Group North Ukraine under Field Marshal Walter Model. The German forces had to rely on logistical improvisation. With rail connections severed at Proskurov, supply came only through overland convoys on primitive roads. Fuel stocks were critical. Many armored units had fewer than 2 days' worth of fuel when the encirclement formed. To conserve mobility, Hube ordered all non-essential vehicles destroyed and artillery pieces abandoned if they could not be towed. Supply drops by Luftwaffe aircraft were organized, but by spring 1944, the German air transport fleet was severely depleted. Junkers Ju-52s and Heinkel He-111s made limited sorties, but Soviet fighters and poor weather restricted effectiveness. Only a fraction of the required tonnage reached the trapped units. Both sides miscalculated aspects of their planning. The Soviets underestimated the cohesion and mobility of Hube's forces. Despite attrition, the 1st Panzer Army still possessed experienced panzer divisions with commanders capable of organizing rapid counterthrusts. German infantry, though understrength, maintained discipline and cohesion. On the German side, Hitler's rigid directives delayed preparations for breakout, costing valuable time. Resources wasted on futile defense of Tarnopol could have strengthened the main force. Nevertheless, Hube and his staff adapted by preparing a phased withdrawal westward, aiming to maintain a coherent front and prevent collapse into disorder. Propaganda reflected these strategic goals. Soviet newspapers hailed the liberation of towns such as Vinnytsia and Proskurov, reporting the destruction of German columns and predicting the imminent fall of the encircled army. German propaganda minimized setbacks, presenting the situation as a temporary contraction of the front and praising the heroic defense of fortress cities. For soldiers and civilians on the ground, the contrast between official reports and the reality of retreat, shortages, and devastation was stark. Both sides understood that the coming weeks would decide whether the 1st Panzer Army would be annihilated or escape, and whether Western Ukraine would remain contested or fall decisively under Soviet control. The clash around Kamenets-Podolsky began in earnest in the last days of March 1944, when Soviet formations sought to close the encirclement completely and eliminate the German 1st Panzer Army. The 60th Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army drove south toward Kamenets-Podolsky, while the 3rd Guards Tank Army moved from the east to tighten the ring. At the same time, Soviet forces from the 2nd Ukrainian Front advanced from Uman and crossed toward the Dniester Valley, threatening to block all western escape routes. The speed of the Soviet advance was considerable. Tank corps covered 20-30 kilometers daily when weather permitted, and infantry divisions followed close behind. Villages and small towns, many of them already devastated by earlier fighting, became scenes of short, brutal clashes before German rearguards withdrew further west. German resistance during these early engagements was fragmented but determined. Divisions such as the 1st Panzer, 16th Panzer, and 17th Panzer mounted localized counterattacks designed to slow Soviet armor. For example, in battles near Yarmolinsky and Dunayevsky, German panzer units reportedly destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks at close range before withdrawing. However, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Red Army, at least 3.1 in tanks and 2.1 in infantry in most sectors, made continued positional defense untenable. Soviet air operations further disrupted German movements, with ground attack aircraft of the 2nd Air Army targeting convoys, artillery batteries, and crossings. Pilots flew hundreds of sorties daily, limiting German ability to concentrate forces. By 26 March, Soviet spearheads had effectively surrounded the 1st Panzer Army in a vast pocket stretching roughly 45 kilometers east to west and 20-30 kilometers north to south. The main concentration was around Kamenets-Podolsky, with additional German corps clustered near Chortkov and along the Smotrich. Food and ammunition stocks ran low, while horses and fuel dwindled rapidly. Despite these conditions, German command maintained cohesion. Hube divided his army into several Kampfgruppen, each tasked with securing sectors of the perimeter and preparing for breakout attempts. Corps commanders coordinated closely to prevent Soviet breakthroughs from fragmenting the pocket. The civilian population bore heavy consequences. Thousands of Ukrainians, many already displaced by earlier battles, found themselves in the middle of the encirclement. Soviet accounts describe villages emptied as residents fled into forests or hid in cellars during bombardments. German forces requisitioned livestock, carts, and food, worsening shortages. For civilians, the rapid succession of Soviet advances and German withdrawals meant repeated exposure to both armies' demands. Partisan units in western Ukraine also took advantage of the disarray, ambushing German convoys and guiding Soviet spearheads through forests and river valleys. German countermeasures included reprisals against suspected partisan supporters, further intensifying civilian suffering. Several clashes during this period became pivotal. On 28 March, the Soviet Third Guards Tank Army attempted to cut off the southern escape route toward the Dniester by seizing crossings near Khotin. However, German rearguards fought with determination, holding bridgeheads long enough for supply columns to pass. On 30 March, the 4th Tank Army pushed toward the town of Satanov, aiming to sever the last link to the west. Hube personally coordinated counterattacks with the 6th Panzer Division, buying critical time. These delaying actions highlighted the resilience of the 1st Panzer Army. Unlike Stalingrad, where encircled forces had been immobilized and exhausted, Hube's troops retained enough armor and discipline to mount flexible defenses. Conditions within the pocket deteriorated steadily. Soldiers marched through deep mud, pulling guns with teams of exhausted horses or with manpower alone. Motorized columns stretched for kilometers, moving slowly under constant air harassment. Ammunition expenditure was tightly rationed. Artillery batteries were ordered to fire only in emergencies, while infantry often relied on close-quarter engagements. German medical services faced overwhelming casualties, with improvised field hospitals lacking bandages, medicines, and shelter. Reports indicate that many wounded were left behind during retreats, unable to be evacuated. The morale of the troops, while strained, remained surprisingly intact. Veterans recalled that discipline held because the soldiers trusted Hube's leadership and believed a breakout was still possible. For the Soviets, early successes created confidence but also posed challenges. Rapid advances stretched supply lines, and fuel shortages began to affect their own tank armies. Bridges over rivers such as the Zbruch and Smotrich were damaged or destroyed, delaying reinforcements. Soviet commanders also underestimated the speed with which Hube could shift forces inside the pocket. While Soviet newspapers announced that the German army was encircled and doomed, in practice, the Red Army still faced fierce resistance and repeated counterblows. The need to secure wide fronts, prevent German breakouts, and continue advancing west created strains. Soviet casualties mounted. Estimates suggest that by the end of March, losses in the First Ukrainian Front exceeded 30,000 men, with several hundred tanks destroyed or disabled. As March turned into April, the clash intensified. Hube launched a series of coordinated thrusts westward, concentrating his armor into spearheads that struck at Soviet blocking positions. These efforts were not intended to break out in a single push, but rather to keep routes open, maintain mobility, and draw Soviet forces away from the main concentration. Fighting around Chortkov and Buchak was particularly severe. Villages changed hands multiple times, with German panzers using surprise assaults at dawn or dusk to dislodge Soviet units before withdrawing again. Soviet accounts describe heavy losses among rifle divisions, forced to repel these counterattacks without adequate anti-tank support. By early April, the ring had not closed as tightly as Stavka had hoped. The Soviets controlled most crossings over the Dniester, but gaps remained near Khotin and Zalishchaiki. These gaps became the focal point of German planning. Hube intended to concentrate his army into a massive moving column, push westward through these openings, and cross the Dniester to safety. Preparations began in secret, with strict radio discipline and camouflage. German engineers worked night and day to repair bridges and prepare makeshift fords, often under artillery fire. Reconnaissance units scouted routes through villages and forests, identifying paths that could sustain thousands of men and vehicles. Meanwhile, the intensity of clashes along the perimeter increased. On 3-4 April, Soviet armored thrusts attempted to cut the pocket in two, targeting the junctions between German corps. At one point, the 1st Guards Tank Army broke through near Yarmolinsky, threatening to split the 1st Panzer Army into northern and southern groups. Hube responded by concentrating the 6th Panzer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, counterattacking with about 70 operational tanks. After 2 days of heavy fighting, the breakthrough was sealed, though at significant cost. These engagements demonstrated both the fragility of the German position and the continued effectiveness of their countermeasures. The first engagements of the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket therefore unfolded as a dynamic contest of maneuver, rearguard actions, and attrition. The Soviets achieved deep penetrations and established an encirclement, but the Germans avoided collapse by maintaining cohesion and launching timely counterthrusts. The result was a situation of crisis but not yet disaster for the 1st Panzer Army. Both sides understood that the decisive battles were still ahead, as the Soviets sought to complete annihilation, and the Germans prepared for a desperate breakout across the Dniester. The escalation of the Kamenets-Podolsky operation in early April 1944 turned the encirclement into a full-scale crisis. With Soviet armies pressing from all directions, the 1st Panzer Army faced the imminent threat of destruction unless a coordinated breakout could be achieved. For the Red Army, the focus shifted from rapid advances to consolidating the pocket and preventing escape. Zhukov and Konev directed their fronts to hold blocking lines along the Dniester, while tank armies and rifle corps pressed inward to shrink the encircled area. Soviet operational orders emphasized preventing the Germans from concentrating their armor, isolating corps groups, and cutting them into smaller, more manageable fragments. German command, however, maintained cohesion under General Hube's leadership. By early April, the 1st Panzer Army reorganized its encircled forces into a structured march group, with armored spearheads at the front, infantry corps forming a protective column, and supply and artillery elements interspersed throughout. The force stretched for many kilometers, resembling a moving fortress rather than a static defensive pocket. Discipline and training allowed these formations to maintain order even under constant attack. Hube's decision to keep the army mobile was crucial, as remaining in fixed positions would have invited piecemeal destruction. The terrain and weather posed additional difficulties. The Rasputitsa of spring rendered roads impassable, with entire columns sinking axle-deep into mud. German engineers worked tirelessly to repair routes, build corduroy roads, and prepare crossings over swollen rivers. Horses, still essential for German logistics, died in large numbers from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Soviet forces suffered from the same conditions, with tanks bogging down in fields and trucks immobilized in deep mud. The pace of operations slowed, but the Soviets' numerical superiority allowed them to rotate divisions and maintain pressure on all sides. Casualties mounted rapidly. Between late March and early April, the 1st Panzer Army suffered tens of thousands of losses, both combat and non-combat. Units such as the 309th and 371st Infantry Divisions were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Soviet losses were also significant, with rifle divisions suffering heavy attrition from repeated assaults against entrenched German positions. Estimates indicate that in the battles around Kotin, Yarmolintsy, and Buchak, Soviet units lost thousands of men and dozens of tanks in failed attempts to split the pocket. Both sides endured severe strain. German columns pressed westward in forced marches, while Soviet formations were ordered to attack relentlessly despite exhaustion. Political and command tensions added further pressure. Stalin demanded the destruction of Hube's army, emphasizing that failure would prolong the liberation of western Ukraine and Galicia. Zhukov, facing logistical difficulties and stubborn resistance, urged reinforcements and continued offensives. On the German side, Hitler's directives remained contradictory. He insisted that fortress cities such as Tarnopol continue to be held, diverting precious resources from the breakout. Manstein and Hube argued for freedom of maneuver, stressing that the survival of the 1st Panzer Army depended on immediate westward movement. These disputes highlighted the contrast between high-level orders and frontline necessities, yet Hube managed to interpret Hitler's commands flexibly enough to maintain mobility. International observers followed developments closely. Reports of a major German army trapped in Ukraine reached Allied intelligence. For the Western Allies preparing Operation Overlord, the destruction of the 1st Panzer Army would represent a significant reduction in German strength. For the Germans, saving Hube's forces became a matter of prestige and morale, proving that, unlike Stalingrad, an encircled army could extricate itself through discipline and operational skill. As April progressed, fighting grew more desperate. Soviet armies attempted to compress the pocket from all sides, while Hube concentrated his forces for a thrust toward the Dniester crossings. Every day of delay increased German casualties and reduced their supplies, yet the breakout remained possible as long as Soviet forces failed to close every gap. The campaign had escalated into a test of endurance, mobility, and command skill, with the outcome uncertain. Both sides prepared for the decisive phase, the Soviets to finish the encirclement, the Germans to break free before exhaustion turned crisis into catastrophe. The peak of the Kamenets-Podolsky campaign came in the first 2 weeks of April 1944, when the 1st Panzer Army, numbering around 200,000 men, attempted to fight its way westward under continuous Soviet pressure. By this point, the pocket was not a static encirclement like Stalingrad, but a vast, moving cauldron stretching across the countryside. General Hube had reorganized his army into a single massive column that advanced in phases, with armored divisions at the front and rear, infantry corps in the center, and artillery and supply units interspersed throughout. The column, at times 20 kilometers long, moved slowly through villages, forests, and mud-choked roads, under constant Soviet attack. Soviet High Command understood the stakes. Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian Front and Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front were tasked with preventing the breakout, blocking the Dniester crossings, and annihilating Hube's force. Soviet formations deployed in blocking positions along the Strepa and Dniester rivers, reinforced with tank corps and anti-tank brigades. Between 1 and 15 April, the Soviets committed at least 15 rifle divisions, several mechanized corps, and over 400 tanks to the battle for control of the escape corridors. Soviet aviation intensified operations, with the Second Air Army flying thousands of sorties against German columns, targeting bridges and choke points. Entire villages along the route were destroyed by airstrikes and artillery fire as both sides fought for control of vital terrain. The German breakout unfolded as a series of brutal engagements. On 6 to 7 April, the 6th Panzer Division spearheaded a thrust toward Butsak, clearing Soviet blocking units from ridgelines and opening the way for infantry columns to follow. Villages such as Monastirisk and Podkamen changed hands multiple times as Soviet rifle units counterattacked. German panzer battalions often fought with fewer than 30 operational tanks, yet their concentrated firepower and mobility allowed them to punch through local Soviet defenses. Rearguard actions by the 1st and 17th Panzer Divisions held off Soviet counterthrusts from the east, ensuring the column was not cut in two. The constant movement prevented the Soviets from closing the ring entirely, but at a terrible cost in men and equipment. Conditions inside the column reached extremes. Supplies were critically low, soldiers survived on half rations or less, while artillery crews fired only a handful of shells per day. Ammunition was scavenged from abandoned depots or captured stocks. Horses died by the thousands, forcing units to burn or abandon guns they could no longer move. Many wounded were left behind in villages or improvised shelters, unable to be transported. Eyewitness accounts later described the breakout as a march of steel, in which divisions moved as a single organism, protecting each other from collapse. Soviet resistance was equally determined. Tank brigades repeatedly attempted to cut across the German route, striking at flanks or blocking crossroads. In several cases, Soviet armor succeeded in isolating sections of the column. On 9th April, near Terabovlia, Soviet units briefly cut the road, splitting the 1st Panzer Army's vanguard from its rear. For 2 days, fierce battles raged as the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart counterattacked, restoring contact and reopening the route. Soviet losses were heavy. Dozens of tanks were destroyed in close-range battles with German panzers and anti-tank guns, but the Red Army replaced them with fresh units drawn from its reserves. Civilian suffering intensified during requisition stripped communities of livestock and food, while bombardments leveled homes. Both Soviet and German accounts note that civilians were often left without shelter or supplies. The rapid pace of combat left no space for humanitarian measures. For many Ukrainians, the battles of spring 1944 represented a cycle of devastation: German occupation, Soviet liberation, and renewed fighting, each bringing further destruction. Strategic decision-making during this period was critical. Hube's insistence on maintaining the cohesion of his army prevented disintegration. Rather than allowing divisions to attempt independent escapes, he forced them to remain within the marching column, even if it meant slower progress. This cohesion prevented Soviet forces from cutting the pocket into smaller, more vulnerable fragments. Meanwhile, Hitler's orders complicated matters. He continued to demand that fortress cities like Tarnopol hold out, even as they were surrounded and destroyed. Divisions wasted in these static defenses could have bolstered the breakout. Manstein and Hube nevertheless pressed ahead with their plan, often bending Hitler's directives without outright disobedience. By 12th April, the column had reached the approaches to the Dniester River. Soviet forces held most major crossings, but reconnaissance identified fords and secondary bridges still intact near Chortkov and Zalishchaiki. German engineers began preparing pontoon bridges and makeshift crossings under fire. On 14th April, the 6th and 17th Panzer Divisions launched concentrated attacks against Soviet blocking forces clearing access to the riverbanks. Fierce battles ensued, with Soviet rifle corps supported by tanks trying to prevent the crossing. German artillery, though limited in shells, concentrated fire on Soviet strongpoints, while panzer units forced gaps. Thousands of soldiers and vehicles began crossing the Dniester on improvised bridges, ferries, and shallow fords, often under direct Soviet fire. Losses were heavy. Bridges collapsed, vehicles drowned, and men were swept away by the current, but the crossing succeeded in transferring large sections of the army to the western bank. The culmination of the breakout came in mid-April, when the remnants of the 1st Panzer Army linked up with elements of Army Group North Ukraine. Although battered, short of equipment, and suffering tens of thousands of casualties, the army had escaped total destruction. The Soviets had inflicted enormous damage, but had failed to annihilate Hube's force. For the Red Army, the campaign still represented a major victory. Western Ukraine was liberated, and German forces had been pushed back toward Galicia and the Carpathians. For the Germans, survival itself was seen as a triumph, proving that unlike Stalingrad, a trapped army could extricate itself through disciplined maneuver and skilled leadership. The peak of the Kamenets-Podolsky campaign thus illustrated both the scale of Soviet offensive power and the resilience of the Wehrmacht under crisis. In 2 weeks of brutal fighting, tens of thousands of men were killed or captured, entire regions were devastated, and one of the largest encirclements of the Eastern Front had taken shape. Yet the outcome remained ambiguous. The Soviets achieved liberation and territorial gains, while the Germans salvaged a major field army. The consequences of this peak phase would reverberate in the next stages of the war, influencing operations in Galicia, Poland, and beyond. The period following the breakout across the Dniester marked a phase of resistance and adaptation for both the German. Although the Germans had succeeded in escaping total annihilation, the army remained in a precarious state. Divisions were heavily depleted, with some infantry units reduced to a few hundred effectives. Armored formations often counted fewer than 24 operational tanks, and artillery strength had fallen sharply due to abandoned or destroyed pieces during the march. Despite these losses, the 1st Panzer Army retained enough cohesion to continue organized movement and to resist Soviet pursuit. Hube directed his forces westward toward the foothills of the Carpathians, aiming to link up with Army Group North Ukraine under model. The escape from the pocket had been achieved through strict discipline, but survival now depended on adaptation to continued Soviet pressure. German engineers played a crucial role, repairing roads, constructing bridges, and improvising routes for the exhausted columns. The spring thaw continued to hamper movement, with mud bogging down vehicles and slowing supplies. Horses were nearly exhausted, forcing units to rely increasingly on manpower to pull carts and light artillery. Medical services operated under extreme strain, evacuating wounded when possible, but often leaving the gravely injured behind. Improvised hospitals in villages filled with hundreds of casualties, tended by overworked doctors and medics with dwindling supplies. Soviet forces pressed hard to complete the destruction of the retreating army. Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian Front, supported by the 2nd Ukrainian Front, redeployed its tank and mechanized corps to cut off German escape routes toward Galicia. Blocking lines were established along the Strypa and Seret rivers, with fresh rifle divisions moved into position to bar crossings. Soviet aviation maintained relentless pressure, flying thousands of sorties against retreating German columns. Reports describe entire convoys destroyed on roads, with tanks, wagons, and men left burning in ditches. Yet the mobility and cohesion of Hube's column again frustrated Soviet attempts to impose complete encirclement. German units employed a combination of counterattacks and flexible rearguards to resist Soviet thrusts. Small groups of panzers, often supported by assault guns and concentrated artillery, struck at Soviet spearheads attempting to block the path. These attacks were costly but effective in opening corridors for infantry and supply trains to pass. The 6th Panzer Division, despite severe depletion, remained particularly effective, conducting several sharp counterstrokes that stalled Soviet advances for days at a time. Infantry divisions, though, the principle was clear: sacrifice equipment and manpower if necessary, but keep the army moving westward as a single entity. Resistance was not limited to the German side. Soviet formations also adapted to the difficulties of terrain and weather. When tanks bogged down in mud, infantry pressed forward on foot, often supported by artillery brought up through immense effort. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges and repaired damaged roads, while supply depots were pushed forward to keep pace with the offensive. Soviet commanders attempted to coordinate deep strikes to cut German lines of march, but the scale of the breakout complicated these efforts. Hube's army constantly shifted direction, avoiding fixed points of destruction and exploiting gaps in Soviet deployments. Partisan forces in western Ukraine increased their activity during this stage, striking at isolated German columns, destroying bridges, and ambushing supply convoys. While not decisive on their own, these actions compounded the pressure on the retreating army. German countermeasures included harsh reprisals against villages suspected of aiding partisans, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Civilians thus found themselves once again at the mercy of both armies, enduring requisitions, bombardments, and reprisals with little means of escape. The psychological toll of the retreat was enormous. German soldiers marched day and night with little rest, often fighting running battles along the way. Exhaustion, hunger, and constant exposure to Soviet artillery and airstrikes wore down morale, yet discipline largely held. Soldiers clung to the belief that survival depended on unity and trust in Hube's leadership. Soviet troops, for their part, faced equally harsh conditions. Assaults against entrenched German rearguards inflicted high casualties, while the pursuit demanded continuous movement across devastated terrain. Both sides demonstrated extraordinary endurance, adapting to circumstances that might otherwise have led to collapse. By mid-April, the 1st Panzer Army had reached the relative safety of German-held positions west of the Dniester. Although the retreat had cost tens of thousands of casualties and the loss of much of its heavy equipment, the army had avoided destruction. For the Soviets, the inability to annihilate Hube's force was a disappointment, yet the liberation of western Ukraine and the advance to the Carpathians represented a strategic victory. The Germans had resisted with skill and cohesion, but their capacity to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds came at the cost of irreplaceable men and materiel. The resistance and adaptation displayed during this stage ensured the survival of the 1st Panzer Army, but the consequences were long-term. German divisions were shadows of their former strength, and the Wehrmacht could not replenish them to full capacity. The Soviets, despite heavy casualties, retained momentum and the ability to launch further offensives. The outcome of this phase was therefore twofold. The Germans had demonstrated resilience under crisis, while the Red Army had secured the operational initiative that would carry it into Galicia and toward the borders of Central Europe. The turning point of the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket came in the second week of April 1944, when the German 1st Panzer Army, having endured weeks of encirclement, finally managed to force its way out toward the west. The decisive moment centered on the crossings of the Dniester River and the ability of Hube's forces to link with Army Group North Ukraine. Soviet attempts to close the pocket permanently had failed to compress the German army into a static trap, and instead the encirclement became a moving battle, stretching across dozens of. Hube concentrated his remaining armored strength, primarily the 6th, 17th, and 1st Panzer Divisions, supported by the 1st SS Panzer Division, into spearheads that would strike Soviet blocking forces head-on. Infantry corps followed behind in organized columns, while engineers prepared bridging equipment and scouted fords. The army moved as a single entity, refusing to fragment, ensuring that no corps was left isolated. Despite shortages of fuel and ammunition, This concentration of force gave the Germans enough striking power to punch through Soviet lines. The Soviets, however, recognized the danger and concentrated their own forces along the Dniester. Rifle corps were entrenched on the western bank, with tank and mechanized units positioned to counter any crossings. Artillery and air support were massed to bombard likely crossing points. Between 9 and 12 April, fierce battles raged near Chortkov, Bukak, and Zalishchyky. Soviet forces attempted to block the German spearheads at every turn, launching repeated counterattacks. In some cases, Soviet rifle units fought to the last man defending ridgelines or bridgeheads. Nevertheless, German panzers, supported by disciplined infantry, managed to carve openings. The critical moment occurred between 12 and 14 April, when the vanguard of the 1st Panzer Army succeeded in forcing crossings over the Dniester. Pontoon bridges were erected under fire, ferries carried men and vehicles across, and in some cases, troops waded or swam through shallow sections of the river. Losses were severe. Vehicles sank, bridges collapsed, and men drowned, but the operation succeeded in transferring large parts of the army to the western bank. Soviet artillery bombarded the crossings continuously, and Soviet aircraft struck with bombs. For the Soviets, the failure to close the pocket definitively marked the turning point of the campaign. Despite enormous efforts, they had not achieved the destruction of the 1st Panzer Army. Soviet commanders later acknowledged that while they had liberated western Ukraine and inflicted heavy losses, the German army had managed to preserve its core strength. Estimates suggest that of the roughly 200,000 men originally encircled, at least 150,000 escaped, albeit with severe equipment losses. Soviet accounts recorded more than 40,000 German casualties, along with the destruction of large quantities of tanks, guns, and vehicles. Yet for the Red Army, the inability to annihilate Hube's force outright meant that further campaigns would be required in Galicia and Poland. The turning point also highlighted the contrast between Soviet and German command methods. The Soviets relied on overwhelming force and broad encirclement maneuvers, but struggled with logistical overstretch and the challenge of sealing such a large formation. The Germans, under Hube, demonstrated remarkable operational discipline, using mobile counterattacks, strict march organization, and continuous movement to avoid collapse. This difference shaped the outcome. The Soviets gained territory and strategic initiative, but the Germans avoided catastrophe. The impact on civilians in the region was devastating. Villages along the Dniester crossings were destroyed in the fighting, with many inhabitants killed or displaced. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians fled into the countryside seeking shelter from bombardments. Others were caught between retreating German forces and advancing Soviets, enduring requisitions, looting, and reprisals. The shifting front left western Ukraine a devastated landscape, with fields ruined, livestock gone, and infrastructure shattered. By mid-April, the turning point had been reached. The 1st Panzer Army had escaped the trap, though battered and weakened. The Red Army had liberated large swaths of Ukraine, pushing the front line westward into Galicia. Strategically, the Soviets had gained the initiative, forcing the Germans onto the defensive in Eastern Europe. But the German escape carried its own weight. It preserved experienced divisions that would fight again in the battles for Lvov, Poland, and Hungary. This outcome demonstrated that while Soviet deep operations could achieve encirclements, the destruction of disciplined and mobile German forces remained a formidable challenge. The Kamenets-Podolsky pocket thus stood as both a Soviet triumph of liberation and a German success of survival, the balance tipping decisively toward the Soviets only because of the broader strategic momentum of 1944. The aftermath of the breakout from the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket unfolded during the second half of April 1944. While the German 1st Panzer Army had avoided total annihilation, its escape was achieved at enormous cost. The retreat left behind thousands of dead, tens of thousands of wounded, and most of the Army's heavy equipment. Entire batteries of artillery were destroyed or abandoned, and many tank battalions were reduced to only a handful of operational vehicles. The march westward was a grim procession. Columns of exhausted soldiers trudging through ruined villages, horses collapsed in mud, and makeshift convoys carrying the wounded toward the Carpathians. For the Soviets, the immediate consequence was the liberation of all of right bank Ukraine. By the end of April, Red Army units had reached the foothills of the Carpathians and the borders of Galicia. The Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive, which had begun on Fordor March, had lasted 6 weeks and advanced more than 200 kilometers. Dozens of major towns, including Vinnytsia, Proskurov, Ternopil, and Chernivtsi, were retaken. The Red Army claimed the destruction of large parts of the 1st Panzer Army, reporting that more than 40,000 Germans were killed and over 200 tanks and assault guns destroyed. These figures, while likely exaggerated in propaganda, reflected the scale of the German losses. The Soviet success also severed German control of Ukraine, with only the far western provinces remaining under occupation. For the Wehrmacht, the consequences were severe. The 1st Panzer Army, though not destroyed, emerged from the pocket in a state of exhaustion. Some divisions counted fewer than 3,000 men, far below their nominal strength of 12,000–15,000. Panzer divisions often had fewer than 20–30 serviceable tanks each, compared to authorized strengths of over 150. The Army lost most of its artillery, heavy weapons, and supply stockpiles. Even though rebuilding these formations was beyond the capacity of the German war economy in 1944, which was already strained by the demands of multiple fronts, retreat also meant a loss of strategic ground. The Germans abandoned Ukraine's last major agricultural regions, losing vital grain and livestock resources. Rail lines connecting Central Europe to the southern front were pushed back toward Poland and Hungary, increasing supply distances and reducing operational flexibility. Hitler's insistence on holding fortress cities like Tarnopol proved costly. Tarnopol was surrounded in late March, and despite orders to resist, fell on 15th of April after weeks of heavy. The humanitarian situation across western Ukraine was dire. Battles had left towns and villages devastated, with thousands of civilians killed or displaced. Soviet authorities quickly moved to re-establish control, organizing food distribution and reintroducing collective farm structures. However, destruction of infrastructure meant that famine and hardship persisted. Partisan units, now able to operate more openly, helped secure communication lines and eliminate remnants of German garrisons. Many civilians viewed the Soviet return with relief, though others feared repression, deportations, and renewed political purges. The transition of control was thus marked by both liberation and fear. The Wehrmacht's retreat also created a psychological impact. For German soldiers, survival was celebrated, but the comparison to Stalingrad loomed large. Unlike Paulus's 6th Army, Hube's command had escaped encirclement. Yet the reality was that the army was crippled and the Eastern Front had shifted decisively westward. German propaganda portrayed the breakout as a masterful maneuver, while Soviet propaganda emphasized the liberation of Ukraine and the massive German losses. Both narratives highlighted the symbolic importance of the campaign. Internationally, the operation demonstrated the Red Army's growing strength. Allied observers noted that the Soviets were capable of encircling and forcing retreats of entire German armies. The Kamenets-Podolsky pocket reassured the Western Allies that the bulk of the German military was tied down in the east, reducing pressure on preparations for Operation Overlord. For Stalin, the operation confirmed that Soviet strategy of large-scale encirclements and deep operations was effective. Although they remained in the field, their ability to resist further Soviet offensives was limited. The Red Army, despite heavy losses, had momentum and the initiative. The aftermath of the Kamenets-Podolsky operation thus set the stage for the next great offensive, the Lvov-Sandomierz campaign in the summer of 1944. The battle's immediate consequences were visible across Ukraine: liberated cities, shattered armies, devastated communities, and its strategic repercussions reverberated far beyond the region. It was clear that the balance of the war in the East had shifted irreversibly against Germany. The legacy of the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket has remained a subject of historical analysis, illustrating both the strengths and limitations of the opposing armies in 1944. For the Soviet Union, the operation marked the liberation of nearly all of western Ukraine and the advance to the Carpathian Mountains. It demonstrated the Red Army's ability to plan and execute deep operations, using multiple fronts to encircle a major enemy force. Soviet forces advanced more than 200 kilometers in little over a month, liberating cities such as Proskurov, Vinnytsia, and Chernivtsi. Politically, the success reinforced Stalin's position as the Red Army's supreme leader and strengthened Soviet claims over Eastern Europe in the coming post-war order. Yet the operation also revealed limitations. Despite numerical superiority and the advantage of strategic initiative, the Soviets failed to annihilate the 1st Panzer Army. German forces retained their cohesion, avoided fragmentation, and preserved a large proportion of their manpower. Soviet commanders later acknowledged that logistical challenges, spring weather, and the difficulty of sealing a moving encirclement had allowed Hube's army to escape. The inability to repeat the complete destruction achieved at Stalingrad suggested that German operational skill and discipline could still frustrate Soviet objectives even in the later stages of the war. For Germany, the battle embodied both disaster and survival. The 1st Panzer Army suffered enormous losses, tens of thousands of men, most of its armor, artillery, and supplies, but it avoided the fate of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. General Hube's leadership was praised as a model of disciplined withdrawal under encirclement conditions. The German High Command celebrated the breakout as a masterly maneuver, using it to bolster morale at a time of continuous retreats. Nevertheless, the strategic picture was bleak. Ukraine, once touted as the Reich's breadbasket, was lost, and the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat toward Galicia and the borders of Poland and Hungary. The loss of this territory deprived Germany of vital resources and opened the way for Soviet offensives deeper into Central Europe. The battle also influenced future German command decisions. The contrast between Hitler's rigid fortress orders and Hube's flexible operational methods highlighted the dangers of political interference in military affairs. Tarnopol's destruction, in particular, underscored the futility of static defense when surrounded. For the officer corps, the Kamenets-Podolsky breakout demonstrated that survival was possible only through maneuver, not blind adherence to Hitler's directives. This lesson, however, did little to change Hitler's policies, which continued to demand the defense of cities and territory regardless of military feasibility. In the long term, the campaign shaped both memory and commemoration. Soviet historiography emphasized the liberation of Ukraine, presenting the battle as part of the unstoppable march toward Berlin. German accounts, written after the war, often portrayed the breakout as a rare example of skillful maneuver under impossible circumstances. Memoirs of German officers highlighted the discipline and cohesion of the troops, while Soviet veterans recalled the ferocity of the fighting and the difficulty of destroying a determined enemy. Western historians have since placed the battle within the larger context of 1944, noting that it coincided with Allied preparations for the Normandy landings and demonstrated the multi-front pressure that Germany could no longer withstand. Culturally and politically, the memory of the operation lived on in Ukraine as part of the narrative of liberation from occupation. Yet it also left a legacy of devastation. Entire regions were depopulated, infrastructure destroyed, and communities scarred by reprisals and bombardments. The spring of 1944 was remembered not only as a time of liberation but also of suffering, as civilians endured the consequences of one of the largest encirclement operations of the war. In historical debates, the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket is often cited as a paradox, a Soviet victory that achieved territorial liberation and inflicted heavy losses, but also a German success in preserving a field army against overwhelming odds. Strategically, however, the balance was clear. After April 1944, Germany no longer controlled Ukraine, its armies were pushed back toward Central Europe, and the Red Army held the initiative. The breakout allowed Hube's soldiers to fight again in Galicia and later in Hungary, but it could not alter the course of the war. The Kamenets-Podolsky operation thus stands as a decisive moment in the collapse of German power in the East, both a testament to Soviet strength and a final display of German resilience before the inexorable advance toward Berlin.